Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Bronwyn Pearce and you're with Reasonable Faith Adelaide. Tonight we're talking about the scientific, we're talking about young earth creation and old earth creation and the scientific and biblical arguments that surround them. And our guest speaker tonight is Dr. Hugh Ross from Reasons to Believe. Before I pass over to Hugh, I'll just read a little blurb from his book, Navigating Genesis, by Dr. Michael Strauss. And he writes, in Navigating Genesis, Hugh Ross clearly shows how the early chapters of the Bible and modern scientific findings seamlessly mesh together, telling a consistent story about the origin of the universe and the early history of humans, without compromising either the biblical text or the scientific discoveries. Such a picture is crucial if Christians are to make the case that the Bible is inspired by God and relevant to our current culture. Dr. Ross's respect for and understanding of both the biblical record and the scientific facts should be a model for theologians and scientists, and gives continued support that the Christian scriptures and the natural realm were sculptured by the same artist, Dr. Michael Strauss from the University of Oklahoma. And with that, I'll pass over to Hugh Ross, who's with us all the way from America. And thank you.
Sure. Well, I just heard that one of you is experiencing -2 centigrade. It's summer, of course, here in California, but I'm from Canada, and I did observations on a radio telescope there where the temperature would drop down to -43 centigrade. And when it's that cold, when you spit, your spit freezes before it hits the ground, actually shatters on the sidewalk. So it gets cold in Australia, but it gets a lot colder where I grew up in Canada.
Yeah.
I am an astrophysicist. I got my PhD in astronomy from the University of Toronto and did research for 5 years on quasars and galaxies at Caltech. And when I joined the Caltech faculty, I was recruited by a church a few miles away to join their pastoral staff. I've been on the pastoral staff now for more than 4 decades. And I'm also serve as a part-time faculty member in the divinity school at Regent University. So I come here both as a theologian and as a scientist, an astrophysicist in particular. So I'm comfortable dealing with the biblical arguments concerning the age of the earth and the universe, and also the scientific evidence. And I grew up at a time in Canada when there was a worldwide debate amongst astronomers over the age of the universe. And there were 2 camps. There was one camp that was saying that the stars are trillions and quadrillions of years old, and therefore the universe had to be at least that old. And then there was the young universe camp that said it was only billions of years old. And it wasn't just a scientific debate. Those that were pushing for quadrillions of years were saying billions of years is not enough time for a naturalistic explanation of life on planet Earth. And therefore we can't go with something as short as billions. I think all of you know the story. By the time you get into the 1960s, astronomers were aware the stars are not that old. We couldn't find any stars that were older than about 13 billion years. And so the young universe astronomers won out. So at least amongst my peers, I'm a young universe astronomer because I believe the universe is only billions of years old, not quadrillions of years old. And that's now a settled debate amongst astronomers. But what I'm going to do is share screen here so you can see some of my visuals. And here we go. Yeah, this particular keynote message is going to be focusing on what does the Bible say about the age of the earth and the universe. And if you're interested, I got a really brief talk, only 5 minutes long, where we look at the scientific case. What has the book of nature got to say? And kind of where I'm going with this is that, the Christian faith is founded on the two books doctrine, that God reveals himself through two books, the book of nature and the book of scripture. And this first slide is simply a reminder. I do take questions on my Facebook and Twitter pages. If you put in Hugh Ross, RTB, it'll pop right up. So if you don't get to ask questions this evening, you can do that, at a future time. But the universe, what does the Bible say? Is it old or is it young? And I want to begin where both young Earth creationists and old Earth creationists agree. Both sides agree that all humans are descended from Adam and Eve, only two humans whom God specially created only tens of thousands of years ago. So that's where both sides agree. And both sides also agree that the literal definitions for the Hebrew word yom that's translated as day includes a long period of time, that there are actually four distinct literal definitions of the word. You see this in every Hebrew lexicon. So that's not a point to dispute. The real debate is over which literal interpretation of yom do we use for Genesis chapter 1. Is it 6 literal 24-hour days, or is it 6 literal long periods of time? And both sides also agree that yom is the only word in biblical Hebrew for a long finite epoch. You do have words for a year, for example, or words for an indefinite period of time, but yom is the only word in biblical Hebrew for a long but finite period of time. And both sides also agree on the doctrine of Sola Scriptura. Although I have run into young Earth creationists that take a slightly different take on this than what the Reformers took. But the Reformers understood Sola Scriptura as the Bible is the only verbal, propositional, authoritative revelation. And during the Reformation, the word authority had a different meaning than it does today in the 21st century. Namely, that authority was looked upon as something that can only rest within a person. And so the Bible is a personal propositional revelation. The book of nature is not a personal revelation, but the Sola Scriptura doctrine is not saying that the Bible is the only revelation from God. It's saying it's the only verbal, propositional, authoritative revelation from God. And where Sola Scriptura came from is the Belgic Confession. This dates back to 1561, and it states in Article 2, we know him, namely God, by two means. First, by the creation, preservation, and government of the universe, since that universe is before our eyes like a beautiful book in which all creatures, great and small, are as letters to make us ponder the invisible things of God. And if you look at the commentary that goes with the Belgic Confession, they were largely drawing this from Psalm 19. But it goes on in Article 2 to say, secondly, he makes himself known more clearly and fully by his holy and divine word. And so is this part of the Belgic Confession that led to the doctrine of Sola Scriptura. There are two reliable and trustworthy revelations, but it's the book of Scripture that more clearly and fully reveals the Redeemer, the Savior, by his holy and divine word. Now, a few things that you see in the book of Scripture that are relevant to this dialogue on old Earth versus young Earth is what it says about the laws of physics. And a passage that's often debated among young and old Earth creationists is Genesis 3:17, where we have Adam falling into sin, and then God says to Adam and Eve, "Cursed is the ground because of you. And I highlighted you because it's not saying that the ground is cursed because God changed the laws of physics. It says that the ground is cursed because you are now in a sinful state. And through your sin, the ground is not going to produce like it would have produced if you hadn't sinned. But if you want more explicit text, these are the different Bible passages in the Old New Testament that talks about the nature of the laws of physics, basically declaring that the laws of physics have not changed. They've remained fixed, they've remained constant since God created the universe. And when it tells us in Romans 8:23, these laws remain fixed until the full number of humans that God intends to redeem have in fact been redeemed. And obviously that hasn't happened yet. We're still trying to bring people to faith in Christ. And once that full number has been redeemed, the universe will have fulfilled its purpose and God's going to replace it with a new creation. And that's where we get different laws of physics. And probably the most explicit text on this is chapter 33 of Jeremiah. And it's good to read the whole chapter because God is speaking to the Jews and said, "You're not like me. You change your mind all the time, but I'm immutable. I'm a God that does not change. As proof, look to the laws that govern the heavens and the earth. As they don't change, I don't change." And so, and then you have the book of Genesis, for example, stating that you got the sun and the stars shining both before and after Adam's fall. And stars are extremely sensitive to the laws of physics. The tiniest changes in the laws of thermodynamics, gravity, or electromagnetism, you either have stars that form and instantly explode or stars that don't shine at all. So the fact that we see the sun and the stars shining before Adam and after Adam implies no change in the laws of physics. Likewise, we see in Genesis that you got Adam and Eve and animals eating both before and after the fall, and the process of eating plant tissue in order to do work, to pump your blood. That again is extremely sensitive to even the tiniest changes in the laws of physics. Is there a comment? Because I will take comments while I'm speaking. If not, I'll keep going. Here's a conclusion. The Bible rules out the young earth doctrine that God radically altered the constants of physics at the flood or at the fall. And I've looked at the whole range of young earth creationist models. 100% of them are fundamentally dependent on the laws of physics being altered by at least a factor of 1,000,000 times at the fall, and in the case of the flood, a factor of 1,000,000,000 times. And this is not just me, an old earth creationist, stating this. You'll see this in the books that have been published by young earth creationists. In particular, the rate study, the 2-volume set of the rate study that was published through cooperation of the Institute of Creation Research and Answers in Genesis. Several times in those books, they state that if there is no change in the laws of physics, then the earth and the universe must be billions of years old, but they claim that the laws of physics did change. Now, I could tell you as an astronomer, we can look at stars and galaxies at all different look back times and measure the laws of physics, and we see there's no change at all. But the Bible, thousands of years before astronomers discovered that the laws of physics have not changed, the Bible explicitly stated no change in the laws of physics. And as I've shared this with the young earth creationists, many of them recognize, okay, I've been mistaken in thinking that there's credibility to the young earth view. The Bible actually rules it out. But another issue of debate, and again, I'll take interruptions, is how long is God's rest?
Hugh,
Rest from? Yes.
before we go on to that, Brian's noted that down here. Brian, we're going to have questions during the talk as something a little bit different tonight. As someone who believes the earth is created somewhere around 6,000 years ago, I have no trouble with the idea that the laws of physics haven't changed. Why is there an issue with the laws of physics changing, Hugh?
Well, particularly the Young Earth creationists believe that the flood of Noah didn't just wipe out the world of ungodly people and their animals. They believe it inundated the entire planet. But to get the entire planet inundated, you do need particularly the radiometric decay rates to be greatly accelerated, because they're trying to explain how you get water over the whole face of the earth, which would require lowering the continental elevations. And then after the flood, you raise them. They also, and from their young earth perspective, believe that all the tectonic activity happened in less than 6,000 years. And to get the tectonic activity that both young and old earth creationists recognize indeed did take place, they have to speed up the constants of physics. And in the case of the flood, they got to speed them up by a factor of 1 billion times. And I've debated several young earth creationists on this issue. And when we get to the flood, they admit that there's a major problem, mainly because in our human bodies and the bodies of all animals, there are radioisotopes. Potassium is a good example. A lot of the potassium in our body is potassium 40. Now, in an old earth perspective, that's not a problem. It's got a decay half-life of 14 billion years, and therefore the decay of potassium in our bodies doesn't terminate your life in less than a few hundred years. But if you speed that up by a factor of 1 billion times, basically all life is instantly wiped out. The heat evaporates all the water on the face of the earth. Matter of fact, you'd even have a problem with the potassium on the moon, because some young earth creationists say, well, maybe the water helps shield or the atmosphere helps shield. But when I've debated Marcus Ross, for example, he says, we young earth creationists have an intractable problem. We cannot solve the problem of the heat release from radiometric decay that we need at the flood. And my response to them was, well, I don't think the Bible teaches a global flood. It teaches a universal flood where all of humanity, except for those on board the ark, are wiped out. And it seems like when you read the early chapters of Genesis, humanity had not become globally extensive. So I'm basically saying, if you take that perspective, but what I've noticed with young earth creationists, that the global flood gave birth to the young earth model, not the other way around. So if you actually read the history of young earth creationism, it was born out of the idea that the flood of Noah was globally extensive, and that flood was responsible for all the tectonic, or nearly all the tectonic activity we see in the face of the earth.
That had been the standard belief of the church over many, many years anyway, before that came along. I don't know why you think that after 2,000 years, the population of humanity couldn't have stretched wider than just the general Middle Eastern area.
Well, what you'll notice in the early chapters of Genesis, there's no geographical place names outside of Mesopotamia, the Persian Gulf, and the Fertile Crescent until
there's very little of anything in that.
Until you get to the post-flood text. Once you get to Genesis 10, now you have global geography right there in the text. But before Genesis 10, there's none of that. And you actually see God commanding Adam, multiply and fill the earth. What you see in Genesis 9, God repeats that command to Noah. And it's not an explicit statement, but it implies that humanity hadn't obeyed that statement. And one of the things
it implies that humanity had to settle over again because everyone else was wiped out.
Yes, But every young Earth creationist scientist I've talked to does agree there weren't humans in Antarctica, and probably not in Greenland either. And therefore, if you look at the book of Leviticus, God pours out his judgment wrath upon reprobation, but only upon reprobation. His judgment wrath never extends beyond the range of human reprobation. So in my model, there's no emperor penguins on board the ark. There's no polar bears because humans had no contact with either the polar bears or the emperor penguins, and therefore they couldn't have been damaged by human reprobate behavior. And when you look carefully at Genesis 7 and 8, it uses a variety of Hebrew words for the animals that were wiped out and the animals taken on board the ark. One of those words is the Hebrew word basar, and it means nephesh animal that is associated with humans. So it's an animal that's been tamed by humans to do the bidding of humans. And these are the animals that the book of Leviticus tells us can be damaged by human reprobate behavior, for the simple reason that these animals, birds and mammals, God designed them to serve and please human beings. And if what brings pleasure to the human owner is for the animal to be vicious, that's how the animal will behave. And therefore, when an animal is bonded to a reprobate human being, that animal becomes dangerous. And so that's why God said, not just the humans, but their animals as well. However, animals that have had no contact with humans wouldn't be in that degraded state. There'd be no need for God to wipe them out. And so what I see in 2 Peter 2:5, it's the world of ungodly people that was wiped out by Noah's flood. So that would mean the extent, the geographical extent of ungodly people. So
that's a valid interpretation, and that's your interpretation, but it has not been the common standard interpretation of Christianity over the hundreds of years.
Well, we can dispute that. I'm a student of church history,
Yes.
and I know that's a big debate between young Earth and old Earth creationists. And I've written a book on this, A Matter of Days, where I say, if you actually look at what the early church fathers wrote on this, they were very ambiguous and vague about the meaning of the days of creation, about the age of the earth. It really wasn't an issue for them. In 2,000 pages of commentary that are existing to this day, they probably wrote more, but we have 2,000 pages that have survived on Genesis 1. Only 2 pages of those 2,000 deal with the timescale issue. They didn't see it as a doctrinal issue worth debating. And their language was vague.
I'm sorry. One of Kevin did ask me quite a few years ago now to give a presentation on Augustus, and Augustus clearly says that the universe, I think he called the Earth at that stage because we only knew what we could see from Earth, was less than 10,000 years old based on the Scripture. That's Augustine, arguably the master.
Well, theologians would highly dispute that because he's cited by old Earth creationists as making a point that these days in Genesis are not ordinary 24-hour days.
Now, that's not what he wrote. I'm sorry, I've seen it. I've read his book. He says less than 10,000 years. I've read his translation. Look, maybe someone translated it wrong, but the translation I saw, less than 10,000 years.
Yeah, I mean, no person who's actually read it in the original Latin would ever make that claim. Nowhere does he say that it's less than 10,000 years.
There's a lot of false interpretations out there because I have read it, and people of the Catholic Church.
Well, you can go to my book. I give you the citations where you can go straight to, and it's online. You can read what Augustine read.
Look, may I now go back to rate? You quoted it. I was reluctant to raise this in my first presentation this year. I read a bit about it, and look, I may be proved wrong, but yes, I'm a young Earth creationist. As I read it, as you look through the rock foundations, but in particular, I think it's the mica strands, you find halos of much greater concentration of halos from alpha particle decay at a particular Precambrian, I think it is, or around about the Cambrian age on the fossils records in the rock stratas that seems to indicate a far greater concentration of radioactivity due to the halos we observe in these microcrystals that we observe in any other of the strata of rock formations. Now that's young Earth. I've not seen it myself, I've not studied it myself, but they just produced the results that they did as they looked through the rock formations and came up with this much greater concentration of halos. And one particular...
Yeah, let me respond to that, because I've
Yes.
responded to that in writing,
Yes.
in my book, and they're referring to polonium halos. But many scientists dispute that the halos are actually the result of polonium decay. And I think what really clearly affirms that, we see uranium halos and we see thorium halos.
Yes.
And those clearly indicate that that material is actually billions of years old. The polonium halos are the ones that are disputed, not the uranium and thorium halos. And it's good just to read both sides of the issues of Proverbs on that. Don't believe something till you read all sides on the issue. And if you like, I'll quickly give my 5-minute talk because I think it'll help. And I really cite the Young Earth Creationists on this. So if you like, I'll stop the this.
Yes, thanks.
And let me go to, here we go. And okay. And let me share screen here. Okay, this is a highly abbreviated presentation. It should only take a few minutes, and actually looks at the perspective of the age of the Earth from a scientific perspective. All Young Earth creationist models predict that all cosmic structures will appear to have ages ranging from 0 to 10,000 years. I have met Young Earth creationists who will go as far as 50,000 years, but the majority say less than 10,000 years. The problem, however, is that the universe is filled with burnt out stars, white dwarfs, neutron stars, and black holes. And for white dwarf stars in particular, the burnout times are in the billions of years. And we actually see burnt out white dwarf stars that have been cooling for a long time. Now, a lay analogy would be an open fire, where you throw logs on the fire, the logs burn, and then all the fuel in the log gets exhausted, so it becomes burnt out, and you got an ember, and it starts off as a bright red color, and then it gets to be orange, and then finally it goes to brown, and then to black. And we know the universe can't be extremely old because we see no black dwarf stars. There are no stars that have completely cooled off. But we do see billions of white dwarf stars that are completely burnt out and have been cooling for different times. And so we can look at a single star cluster and see thousands of white dwarf stars that have cooling times that range from 0 all the way to 6 billion years. And that would be added to their burnout times. So the cooling sequences for white dwarfs established that many of them have been cooling for billions of years. But in my dialogues with Young Earth creationists, I find that a simpler approach is to look at ice cores. And we've been drilling ice cores in northern Greenland and in central Antarctica. And there's actually more that are now being drilled in both those locations. They're actually drilling some in the Alps as well, and the Canadian Rockies. But the three that are in northern Greenland and the three that are in central Antarctica show a continuous record of 800,000 annual layers. Now, Young Earth creationists dispute that these layers are annual, basically citing evidence from southern Greenland. But in southern Greenland, it gets warm in the wintertime, and so you will get multiple layers per year, but not in central Greenland highlands or in the highlands of central Antarctica. And we actually can prove that these layers must be annual because they reveal known volcanic eruptions and 8 cycles of Earth's orbital eccentricity variation, which is simply based on Newton's laws of motion. And so the Earth, as it orbits about the sun, we see that the shape of its orbit changes over a 100,000-year cycle, becoming more elliptical and less elliptical. And this is what you see in the 7 ice cores, is that you can see clearly the changing ellipticity of Earth's orbit, and you can see the dust signature of the eruption of Vesuvius during the times of Rome and the Krakatoa eruption. You can count the number of layers between the dust signature for Krakatoa, the dust signature for Vesuvius, and it adds up exactly to the number of years that we see our calendars for the history of these eruptions. And there are eruptions that we can date back much earlier than the Vesuvius eruption. So basically demonstrates that these indeed are annual layers and indeed reveal the changing eccentricity of Earth's orbit. And so this is what it looks like in total. And all 6 of these deep ice cores yield the identical result that the Earth must be older than 100,000 years. And here I'll wrap things up. And this is something I document in my book, A Matter of Days, with no exceptions. All reliable scientific age measurements confirm that the universe and the Earth are billions of years old. And that would include the methane on Titan. There are many different old Earth models for the methane on Titan. And so the fact that we found less methane does not prove that Titan is young. It simply proves that one of the old Earth interpretations is incorrect and the other one does so. And only a dogmatic insistence on a peculiar interpretation of a few of the Bible's many creation texts would ever cause any scientist to claim the universe is less than 10,000 years old. And 2 public demonstrations of that is a debate I had that lasted for a couple of hours on radio with the president of the Institute for Creation Research and the moderator, who was a lawyer. And he didn't really have a position on this issue, but he asked the question, do you know any scientist who agrees, apart from a particular Bible interpretation, that the universe or Earth is young? And John Morris said, no, I don't. And I had a similar debate with Dwayne Gish. Just let me finish, then you can jump in. Dwayne Gish, same question. He also answered no. And then if you go into the scientific literature, none of the peer-reviewed scientific literature do you see a debate on this issue. Research scientists who don't have a stake in the game and how to interpret the Bible, there's no debate amongst them on the age of the universe. And this is something both Dwayne Gish and John Morris agreed with me on. And likewise, I've gotten the same agreement with every young Earth scientist that I've debated. But yeah, if you want to look into this in more detail, this is the second edition of my book, A Matter of Days. And you can actually look at debates. This is a televised debate I had with Ken Ham.
Hugh, we're
and,
not seeing the we're not seeing your slides. Sorry.
You're not
Me
seeing any of
neither.
the slides?
Yeah. No, we're not seeing your slides. Yeah.
We have only seen the contact stuff.
So when did you stop seeing slides? Did you see any of my slides?
No,
I
no, no.
don't think so.
Only the contact plug.
Oh, really? That's weird.
Yeah, yeah.
Let me stop the share feature here.
Yeah.
Something must have happened with the software because it was looking good on my end.
No, sorry.
Okay, do you see that slide?
Yeah, yeah, we do now.
Okay, so now it's working. And I can go back and show you slides if you want to look at them. But this is a televised debate that I had with Ken Ham and Jason Lyle. And I've had several televised debates. You can get them all from reasons.org. And we distribute the debates exactly as they happened. Unfortunately, the Young Earth versions, they alter the debates where they take material out and add material. But we distribute the debates exactly as they happen, unaltered, unabridged. And so that's just one example. Here's another one, how old the universe. And this is probably the most insightful of debates because we had the Young Earth astronomer, Danny Faulkner, debate me in front of a panel of evangelical conservative astronomers. And so you get to hear their evaluation of the debate as well as what Danny and I presented. But these are just two of multiple examples. But if I were to,
We didn't
still
see
only
that.
see.
Yeah.
I still only see the great debate on Science and the Bible slide.
Yeah.
oh, it sounds like it's not advancing my slides.
No, no.
No, there's no advance of the slides. So I can only show you one
Try
slide at a
doing
time.
it without the actual play thing. Try doing it in the miniature view, preview editing thing.
Well, I can do it as a window view. I've never had the software problem before. This is really weird.
It's not Windows
Oh.
11, is it? Not Windows 11.
So let me,
See that last book or debate would have been good. Yeah.
Yeah, that was it.
The Matter of Days one, wasn't it? Yeah. That one, yeah.
yes, does that show up?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
Now, do you see anything there or nothing?
Yes, got that. You.
Yes.
Okay, so it's working.
Good.
So yeah, I can go back and show you some slides.
Yeah, that's all
Now,
right.
yeah, try flicking between the slides and I'll tell you if I see a different one to A Matter of Days.
Okay, but hey, some questions came up. If you want me to go back to the Bible stuff, I can. But my whole point about the Bible is there are over 24 creation texts in the Bible. And to really settle this issue, you need to look at all 24 plus texts and interpret all of them literally and consistently. I don't think you get very far if all you do is you look at one or two texts. You need to look at them all. And that's how I kind of teach on the Bible systematically, looking at what all 66 books have got to say and realize, hey, we're dealing with a God that can't lie. And so search for the interpretation that allows you to interpret all of them, not just some of them literally.
I think we can go back to the presentation, Hugh, and just take it from
Are
there.
Are
Yeah,
you
look,
still on the Matter of Days slide?
No, we'll go back to his
Okay.
original presentation, I think.
Okay, I'll go
I
back
just
to
want to
the
back up to the, you said Antarctica was isolated. Well, we know there's coal seams in Antarctica. A few years ago, NASA found remains of a palm tree, I think it was, they announced on their website. We know that the poles were moderately, at least forested to some degree, otherwise they wouldn't have coal seams. And I think north of Norway, you have an island, you'd know better than I, Hugh, that has coal seams in it. So it seems that the polar regions were once mild. I'm not going to say warm, but mild enough to have vegetation from which coal was formed.
Well, no one disputes that. The real issue amongst older and young Earth geologists is how rapidly does a plate tectonics occur?
Yes.
In order to explain the coal in Antarctica and the coal in the North, young Earth creationists claim that you get about 9,000 kilometers of lateral plate tectonic movement occurring within the 5 months of the flood. And that's why they have to appeal to radically altered laws of physics, is to get that much plate tectonics in that short of a period of time.
Maybe I didn't explain myself properly. What I'm saying is, you said that the worldwide flood wouldn't have wiped out, say, the penguins from Antarctica, or etc., because it was cold. Well, what I'm trying to say is Antarctica was not like it is now. It certainly was much milder. We may well have had creatures of other forms there. Similarly, in the northern hemisphere, you obviously,
I'm not disputing that.
I've been to Thule in Greenland. I've been to Greenland, so I know it's cold now, but it was.
Yeah, I'm not disputing any of that. I
Yes.
mean, plate tectonics, and this is something old and young Earth creationists agree upon, that Antarctica at one time was connected to Australia.
Yes.
The big debate is over how long ago that happened.
Agreed.
And so older creationists would say, yeah, if you go back 250 million years, they were attached to one another. Young Earth creationists claim they were attached to one another during Noah's flood. But to make that model work, they have to have radically altered laws of physics. And my point is, the Bible rules out that hypothesis. The laws of physics didn't change.
Yes, I didn't mean to
interrupt. Laws
interrupt
of physics didn't change. You can't have Antarctica attached to Australia just a few thousand years ago.
Absolutely not, unless it was something catastrophic. I agree. The other thing, though, if we may go back, how you said, we mentioned potassium, and again, my first lecture, I made the point, and yes, it comes out of the Young Earth Creationists, some of the Mount Helens extrusions that came out after the 1880 volcanic, it was 1981 or 80 eruption, have been measured with potassium carbon dating to millions of years, and yet we know that eruption happened only in 40 years ago now, 40 years ago of that order. So the potassium measurement of recently extruded rock using potassium dating certainly is not true on what we observe on the Earth's surface.
Well, no one would ever use potassium dating to date something that young. With radiometric dating, you only get a reliable date within a factor of 7 of the half-life.
Yes.
So with a half-life of 14 billion years, it's useless for dating Bible manuscripts. It's not going to give you a reliable date. Carbon-14 will, but not potassium. And so the fact that some of these dates don't line up with the date for the eruption is totally understandable. You're way outside the range of the half-life. So,
but
there's no
really
way.
no dispute. There is no independent ground truth for anything we measure that has a half-life that old, and that's the point. There was another one of our fellow people here agreed that you would not have to be at least 2 million years old before it starts to become valid. But there's no ground truth. You can say that measures that particular means of measuring that particular radioactivity, because we don't have any historical event we can say, look, that aligns to that particular measurement.
If you read the rate study, I mean, that was written by 7 or 8 different young Earth creationists, engineers, and scientists. And if you read that study, they make it really clear the young Earth position cannot be defended unless the radiometric decay rates are accelerated by factors of 1 million and 1 billion times at the fall of Adam and at the flood.
Yes.
And as an astronomer, I can tell you, we can check that out. We can look at stars that are 10 light years away, 100 light years away, 10,000 light years away, 1,000,000 light years away, and we can measure the laws of physics. We can measure the radiometric decay rates.
Yes.
And they tell us zero change in the radiometric decay rates. But as I said earlier, the Bible said it 3,000 years ago. We astronomers have simply proved that what the Bible declared thousands of years ago is true. And as far as radiometric decay goes, we know, for example, there was plutonium on the early Earth because we see the decay products of that plutonium.
Yes.
And we know it can only come from plutonium. But there's zero plutonium on the face of the Earth today. It's all decayed away. And again, if there's no change in the laws of physics, that makes perfect sense if the Earth is more than 2 billion years old. But if it's younger than 2 billion years, there should still be some remaining plutonium. There should be some remaining neptunium. So when you look at the periodic table, you don't see neptunium, you don't see plutonium. They have long ago decayed. And yet we can see new forming stars where there's an abundance of neptunium and plutonium. So we know it's being made because we can see it in newborn stars. When we look at old stars, we look at the sun, for example, it has no plutonium, it has no neptunium, but it still has uranium and thorium. If the sun were 1 trillion years old, all the uranium would be gone. So the fact that we see uranium in the spectra of the sun tells us it's not very old, but neither is it very young. And that's something we can do routinely throughout the universe.
Yes.
And likewise with the velocity of light, likewise with the thermodynamic laws and the law of gravity, we can measure those in stars and galaxies at all different look-back times, again affirming what the Bible states, no change in the laws of physics.
But was there not in rock strata a much greater density of halos in, I think it was micro, I might stand corrected there, at a particular phase of the rock strata depths?
Well, again, you need to read the scientific response to that. The fact, what you notice is that people promoting those plutonium halos conveniently ignored the uranium and thorium halos in the same sample. Those unequivocally demonstrate that those rocks are old. They focus on the disputed part, the polonium. Another example of that, you see Young Earth Creation is saying the helium problem in diamonds and zircons.
Yes. Yes.
But helium, I've worked with helium.
Yeah.
It's the most diffusive element in the entire periodic table.
Yes.
Trying to capture helium is extremely difficult. You put it in a bottle, it'll run up the sides of the bottle and out the bottle. You just can't contain the helium. And it's a light gas, so it dissipates easily to outer space. But what doesn't dissipate is the uranium, the thorium, and the decay products of uranium and thorium. The two isotopes of uranium decay into two different isotopes of lead. And then you got thorium decaying in a third isotope of lead. So you can look at those diamonds and those zircons.
Yes.
Helium is not a reliable indicator of age because how it diffuses in and out of the zircons and the diamonds. But the lead isotopes, the uranium and thorium isotopes, they're stable. And that gives you 5 independent measures of the age of the diamond and the age of the zircon. And they're consistent with the Earth being 4.5662 billion years old, with an error bar as tiny as 0.0001 billion. So 5 decimal point confirmation. If you read the scientific literature, nobody uses helium as an age indicator. We know it's useless, but the uranium, the thorium, and the lead, very useful. It's also known the only source of lead is a decay of uranium and thorium. You can't get lead any other way. So the very fact that there's lead on the Earth is evidence that the Earth has been here for billions of years.
The dismissing of helium presence in products sounds like, if I may use Al Gore, an inconvenient truth. Helium is alpha particle decay. It's happening all the time. And we
Well,
know
it
that.
does. My whole point is it's not an age indicator. Now,
Why not?
argon is a better age indicator, still
Yes.
not very reliable, but much better than helium because it's a heavy gas. Helium is a light gas and is
Yes,
a very diffusive gas.
it is.
So no one ever uses helium. You look in the scientific
It
literature.
shouldn't be there anymore, should it?
never
It
used.
should not be there anymore in these rocks. In particular, the one that you probably know, they did some hot rock excavation next to an old volcano. I think it was, they were looking for.
You're missing my point.
Yes.
Helium can diffuse in and out of anything. Therefore, measuring the quantity of helium in any kind of rock sample is a useless age indicator. Same thing's true with
Helium is a
neon.
light,
Same
wood
thing's
comes out.
true.
Yeah. But
Yeah,
it would
'cause
come
neon's
out,
a light
it
gas as
would rise
well.
because it's a light gas. It goes into the atmosphere, even as it is now.
But with argon, it's got an atomic weight of 40.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so the gravity of the Earth will hold it. The
It does,
gravity
yes.
of the moon will hold it. So if you look at the moon, people say the moon has no atmosphere. Well, that's not exactly correct. It's
Okay.
got a very thin argon atmosphere.
Yes.
And the argon comes from the decay of potassium-40. So the
Yes.
very fact that the moon has an argon atmosphere, and with
Yeah.
Earth's atmosphere, it's 1% argon. All of that argon, the only source of argon is potassium-40 decay. And again, with potassium-40, its half-life is 14 billion years. And so the quantity of argon on the moon and in the Earth's atmosphere, unlike helium, helium doesn't give you a date, but the argon does. And the argon we see in Earth's atmosphere and the moon's atmosphere is consistent with both bodies being about 4.5 billion years old.
And yet, as I say, we still see argon there in the rock that was, 40 years old, from supposedly from an eruption. You would expect, in fact, a colleague here in Reasonable Faith Adelaide,
But let me remind you,
must have got into the rock before it came to eruption.
I said this before, the decay of potassium-40 into argon has a half-life of 14.1 billion years.
Yes.
Pardon me, no, it's more than that. And therefore, looking at argon and the rocks from the Mount St. Helens eruption, not an indicator of age, because that only happened 40 years ago.
That's right.
And 40 years is way outside the half-life of the decay of potassium into argon.
Correct.
So no one would ever use that as an age indicator.
You would not expect to see any argon at all there because it's only 40 years ago, and yet there is argon there.
Yeah, Stephen, read literature on this.
Yes,
I mean, again, if you look at the peer-reviewed literature, no one is claiming that there's a problem with the dating of what you see from the Mount St. Helens eruption. I mean, I think you would have a case if there was a debate going on in the scientific literature on the age of the Earth and universe. The truth is, there's no debate. It's just like scientists don't debate, are we on a flat Earth or a spherical Earth?
I agree.
Likewise, they don't debate the age of the Earth. The debate is exclusively amongst people who take a peculiar interpretation of some of the creation texts in the Bible. Scientists who are not wedded to a particular interpretation of the Bible, none of them take a young Earth perspective. And every young Earth creation that debated it acknowledges that the data point is 0. They've never been able to find a scientist in that context who gives any credibility to the Earth and the universe being only thousands of years old. This was actually tried by the US Supreme Court, where they called forth witnesses. And that Supreme Court ruling is available online for free. 1987 Supreme Court ruling on creationism. And what you'll see is scientists, both Christians and non-Christians, saying, in terms of the scientific evidence, the credibility scientifically for the young Earth position is at the same level as the scientific credibility for the flat Earth. You really don't have scientists debating this. It's only debated in Christian circles.
All I'm
It is
saying is,
debated in Islamic circles as well.
yes,
In
yeah.
Islam, you also have young universe creationists,
Yes,
but for
yes.
the same reason. It's based on Bible texts.
Yes, and you're right. No, we often find though that they'll go straight to Genesis chapter 1 and ignore the fourth commandment, which explicitly states the world was created in 6 days and the seventh day was a day of rest. And ever since we've had a 7-day week, as I said back in my presentation, the French revolutionary leaders tried to go to a 10-day week because they recognized fully that that was straight out of the Bible. They wanted to dismiss the biblical account, the religious account. 10 years later, or thereabouts, Napoleon had to give up because the labour run by either animals and or humans in those days, much more modernised now, but the human and the animal kingdom could not keep up a work rate more than 7 days. And so
I've actually written on that. I totally agree with you. And actually in the Soviet Union, in the days of Stalin,
yes,
they also tried a 5-day work week. And that failed just as miserably as the French Revolution 10-day work week.
yes.
However, again, you need to look at everything the Bible's got to say about this. You're citing Exodus 20, but in the Torah, there are 5 texts where you see this reference to the work week. Only 2 of them compare God's work week with our work week. The other 3 do not. And the prepositions that you see in the English translation, they're not there in the original Hebrew. So when it says for in 6 days, the word in is not in the original Hebrew. And also what you see in the Torah, in the book of Leviticus, it talks about a different Sabbath week. There's talking about the Sabbath week of the agricultural land and how it's to be worked for 6 years, and then you're to give it a Sabbath rest of 1 year. And without pesticides, you need that year of letting the land be fallow to starve out the nematodes. So you actually get greater productivity when you work the agricultural land for 6 years and rest it during that 7th year. And the point is this: we humans have biological limitations. And so we function best where we work 6 days and rest the 7th day. The agricultural land has different biological limitations. So it has a Sabbath of 1 year, and we have a Sabbath of 1 year. God is spirit. He has no biological limitations. So his work period could be as long as he wants, but what you see taught in all 5 of those Torah texts on the Sabbath is the principle of 6 and 1. You work 6 periods, you rest on the 7th period. Now the time is different for the agricultural land than it is for humans. And if you read those 5 texts in the original Hebrew, it's declaring an analogy, not an equation. And numerous theologians with doctoral degrees in Hebrew have written on this text. And where you see their concurrence is that this is an analogy, it's not an equation. Gleason Archer in particular has written the most extensive treatise on how to interpret Exodus 20. And I cite him in the book of Matter of Days, and I take you through the exegetical details of the grammar and the word order.
I'm just having a bit of interference. Just having a bit of interference, Hugh. Sorry. Is it your phone, Tom? Or no?
I'm sorry, was I not on mute?
Yeah, sorry, yeah.
Oops.
Could you go back a little bit, Hugh? Yeah, that's good.
Okay, can you all see this slide?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Well, this is kind of a second point in the talk before we went on to different subject matters. How long is God's rest and what does he rest from? I think this is relevant to the Exodus 20 passage that was just brought up. And again, integrate all the biblical texts. And these are the different creation texts. This is not a complete. These are just the passages in the Bible where we got a half chapter or more on creation theology. There's actually 1,500 verses that deal with the subject of creation in the Bible. We give you a complete list on our reasons.org website. But these are the Old and New Testament chapters where you got a half chapter or more of a content. And again, the principle that we're taking is that we need to integrate all these creation texts literally and consistently. And when we do that, we see a beginning, and I'm going to need to set up my second computer here. So let me do that because all of your images are blocking my view here. Yeah. A beginning and an ending bracket the first 6 days. But notice there's no ending assigned to day 7. The Hebrew words for beginning and ending, for morning and evening, if you look at the Hebrew lexicons, each of those Hebrew words has 3 distinct literal definitions. And I've spoken about this issue around the world. What I've observed is this is predominantly an English language controversy over whether or not the Bible says the earth is young or the earth is old. And my explanation for that, English is by far the biggest vocabulary language that has ever existed. It's now more than 4 million words. Biblical Hebrew's vocabulary size is just 3,000 words, if you don't count the names of people and cities. And therefore, you've got the challenge of translating a very tiny vocabulary language into an enormous vocabulary language. And in English, we're used to having multiple synonyms for a word, and each word has a distinct literal definition. Because of how tiny the vocabulary of biblical Hebrew is, almost every single biblical Hebrew noun has multiple literal definitions. So when it talks about the morning and the evening, it can equivalently mean the beginning and the ending. And no matter how you interpret the evening morning phrase, at a minimum it's stating each creation day has a definite start time and a definite end time. We can debate what those times are, but there's no dispute. And I've seen this as I've engaged Young Earth Creationist theologians. They do agree that this phrase is saying each day is a start time and a distinct end time. But when you get to day 7, there's no evening morning phrase. And it tells us that God rests after he creates Eve. He stops his creation work. And he is still resting from his creation work. And 2 texts that say that is Psalm 95, verse 11, where it says that God declared on oath, in my anger, they shall never enter into my rest. So it's referring to the capacity of the Hebrews to be able to enter in to his 7th day. And then you see in Hebrews 4 that on the 7th day, God rested from all his work. Anyone who enters God's rest also rests from his own work, just as God did from his. Let
That
us
would imply
therefore.
that the 4th commandment would be that after 6 days of work, we should stop work forever.
Well, God is ceasing from his work of creation. And that's something I noticed when I first picked up the Bible in my late teenage years, is the Bible is declaring for 6 days God created, on the 7th day he stopped creating. And what we notice is that when we do our scientific research, all we see in the human era are natural processes. According to the Bible, that's all we should expect to see. God's resting from his work of creation. And what we hear from Jesus in the Gospels, God rests from his work of creation to achieve his work of redemption. It's in the 7th day that God redeems humanity unto himself. And that's how we celebrate our Sabbath. We stop certain activities to focus on other activities. We're simply following God's pattern. What we also notice is if we go previous to the human era, we see overwhelming scientific evidences for God's performing creation miracles. So before humanity, we see scientific evidence for creation miracles. During the human era, we see none of that. In that context, God's rest answers the fossil record enigma, how suddenly simultaneous appearance of new phyla, classes, and orders. We see that everywhere in the fossil record, before humanity, after humanity, we see zero evidence for that. Probably the most dramatic example of that would be the Cambrian explosion. Naturalists would predict the proliferation of species, if you wait long enough, will produce new genera. And the proliferation of genera, if you wait much longer, will produce new families, and then new orders, new classes, and last of all, new phyla. When you look at the Avalon and Cambrian explosions, it's the exact opposite. The phyla appear first. The diversification of species appears last. In the case of the Cambrian explosion, more than 24 phyla show up at the very beginning of the Cambrian explosion simultaneously and suddenly, the moment that the oxygen reaches a minimum level for the survival of those species. We were talking about Augustine earlier. When you read Augustine, he says, when God performs creation miracles, it's instantaneous. But Augustine believed that these instantaneous creation miracles were time separated. They didn't all happen at once. So there's not just one explosion of light, there's multiple explosions of light. The Avalon, there's 2 Avalon explosions. There's a Cambrian explosion. We get the Triassic explosion. The fossil record reveals that these explosions are everywhere, but refutes the naturalistic models. The phyla show up first, then the classes, then the orders. Last of all, we get the species, which is the exact opposite of what you'd predict from a Darwinian naturalistic evolutionary perspective. The other thing I could add to this is when God created Adam and Eve, there were a little more than 8,000 mammal species on the face of the earth. Today, there's only 4,000, and not a single new mammal species has appeared. So God's at rest. For 6 days he created. On the 7th day, he rested, and his rest continues. So basically establishes day 7 in Genesis chapter 2 cannot be as brief as 24 hours. It must be a long period of time. And when will God's rest day end? Romans 8:23 says it ends when evil has been completely eradicated, and then God will replace this universe with a brand new creation. So here's the conclusion. If creation day 7 is a long time period, then the Genesis 1 grammatical structure requires the first 6 creation days also to be long time periods. And notice in Genesis 2:4, the word day is used to describe the entire creation week. But what you'll see in the theological literature is much more has been written on the 6th day than the 7th day. And this is the day when God creates Adam and Eve. Genesis 1 says that God created both the human male and the human female on the 6th day. But in Genesis 2, we have a lot happening between God creating Adam and God creating Eve. So for example, we see that Adam is created outside the Garden of Eden. He's placed in the garden. He's able to observe the growth of the trees. So he's there long enough to see the trees growing in the Garden of Eden. He tends the garden. I think he tends the garden long enough to realize there's got to be more to life than gardening. And God says, yes, there is. I want you to engage all these soulish animals that I've created to relate to you. And so he observes and studies these soulish animals, and he gives each one a distinct name. And also on the sixth day, we see in the text that God observes that Adam is alone. And most men take a little more time to experience loneliness than women do, but it usually takes quite a bit longer than a 24-hour period. God performs surgery on him. He recovers from his surgery. He wakes up from his anesthesia. And what do we see? He sees Eve. And when he sees Eve, what we see recorded coming out of his mouth is the Hebrew word hapa'am. You'll find that word used more than 20 times in the Old Testament, consistently translated at long last. And so this is evidence that theologians cite that there had to be a considerable period of time, at least several months, between the creation of Adam and the creation of Eve. And it's a similar argument that creation day 6 is much longer than 24 hours than Genesis 1's grammatical structure requires that all 7 creation days be longer than 24 hours. And as a number of theologians have pointed out, there's several biblical texts that refer to the antiquity of the earth. Here's one example where it says in Genesis 49:26, your father's blessings are greater than the blessings of the ancient mountains, than the bounty of the age-old hills. Or what you see in Habakkuk 3:6, the ancient mountains crumbled and the age-old hills collapsed. And in particular, I showed this photo in the Canadian Rockies, and it's similar to places I've been in the wilderness of Judea, where you see hills and mountains with huge scree slopes at the bottom. And David was writing about this in the Psalms when he was in the wilderness of Judea. And I've been to that wilderness. You'll get a rock falling off the top of one of those hills and small mountains. That happens at a rate of about 2 per week. And yet at the bottom of those hills and mountains, you see this enormous pile of scree. And so David would just see all that and realize, wow, this mountain has been crumbling for a very long time. And we mentioned Augustine earlier. This is what Augustine said in The City of God. What kind of days these are, referring to the days in Genesis 1, is difficult or even impossible for us to imagine, to say nothing of describing them. And earlier I mentioned, none of the early church fathers were explicit about the length of the creation days. The first one who was Isaac Newton. And this is what Newton wrote in a letter to Burnet, who was the chaplain at the Royal Court. He says, now for ye number and length of ye 6 days, by what is said above, you may make ye first day as long as you please, and your second day as well. So he was the first public figure to take an unambiguous stand on the age of the cosmos, and he did that 180 years before Darwin announced his theory.
Hugh, could I just make a quick comment on that one and on Augustine?
Yes.
I, of course, I work out of Silicon Valley, right? Or I have done for about 30 years. And honestly, the amount of times I hear, the accusation, the God of the gaps, oh, you guys just start making up different interpretations of Genesis once you see that science advances a bit. And when I learned that Augustine and the church fathers were actually already questioning the length of the days way back, that really seems to kill that accusation of a God of the gaps dead, because they did that centuries before evolution was even thought of. And
well, that's exactly my point, is that Isaac Newton made this statement before evolution was even considered to be an issue. So But he was the first to be explicit on this. You know, as I've read everything the early church fathers have written on this, is also the patristic fathers, and they were much more concerned about who creates and how he creates. They basically looked at the when issue as doctrinally inconsequential. So they didn't write a lot about it. And what I do in my book, A Matter of Days, I cite the texts that Young Earth Creation has used from the early church and patristic fathers to support their position. I cite the texts that Old Earth Creation has used and basically say, you know, neither side is able to come up with anything really explicit. And so I think the correct assessment is the early church fathers and the patristic fathers really didn't see this as an issue that was worth debating. But one of the most explicit on it was Augustine, but I see Young Earth Creation as citing, well, here he says that creation is instantaneous. Here he says that the days are not 24-hour periods, that we can't determine how long these days are. I think he's being purposely vague on the issue. And when you actually read his stuff about instantaneous creation, it's clear he's saying they don't all happen at once. And actually, given that the Bible gives you a chronology of God creating over 6 days, that itself is evidence these miracles are not all happening at the same time. They're being spread out over time. And people like Augustine were saying, we don't take an issue of what that time frame is. So,
sorry, he does say 10,000 years, Hugh. He does say 10,000 years. I'm trying to find it in his works, but he does say less than 10,000 years.
Okay, where that comes up is when he's talking about fulfilled prophecy and when we're going to get the Revelation text. He's not talking about creation. He's talking about eschatology. That's where these Young Earth creationists are being mistaken. They're confusing Augustine's eschatology with his creation theology. That's the only place where I see him mentioning thousands of years. You can check it out.
Yeah, look, I'm sorry. Yes, I'm looking through my Kindle trying to find where I've got his works somewhere here.
Steve, if I could just make, just to clarify my point, which I think Hugh has already covered in much of his work, obviously, and he's very familiar with. I think as people who are Bible-believing Christians, we should actually want the Augustine text. Forget about, you know, what you end up talking about with Hugh and sorting out the exact terms. We should want the church fathers and Augustine to have actually been questioning the length of the days many, many, many years before evolution, because that so much thwarts.
And he places a bound on it. He places a bound on it.
No, but hang on. I'm not talking about what is right at the moment.
Yes.
I'm talking about what we should hope. We should hope that what Hugh is saying is absolutely correct, because it gives us an evangelical point of history that is actually very, very convincing and powerful to our scientistic friends, and those friends are generally our kids and grandkids. So I'll leave it there, but I think you get my point, right? Well, it sounds like you've already been making my point in spades. Thank you, Hugh.
Yeah,
and Steve, not meaning to write you off.
It's a very good point, Tom, because what you see if you read the entirety of what the early church fathers wrote on Genesis 1, they were much more focused on evangelism. How can we bring unbelievers to faith in Christ? And they said the way we do it from Genesis is to show that it's God that creates, and here's how he creates. And in the context of the time they were living, it was the who and the how that made the strongest point for the Christian faith. And so they looked at the when issue as being inconsequential, because we simply, at the time of the the Roman Empire, we just didn't have the scientific data to make an apologetic case. We do now, but not back then. So their focus was on apologetics. What can we use from the Bible as a way to bring people to faith in Christ. And I find it interesting. We have 2,000 pages of commentary on Genesis 1. So they really did see the importance of creation theology for persuading people that the Bible is the inspired and inerrant word of God. But they said, we're going to focus on the majors. What you see in the early chapters of Genesis is the focus on who and how. So they said, we're going to stick with that as our primary tool to bring people to faith in Christ. And what you see at the time of Isaac Newton, that's when he brings up the when issue. But Isaac Newton realized science had advanced to a point where the when issue could be used as a tool to bring people to faith in Christ. So he explains why for 15 centuries, it was not used as an evangelistic tool. It couldn't be used. But by the time of Isaac Newton, with the establishing of Newtonian mechanics, now it became an effective apologetic tool to bring people to faith in Christ. And that's why I take an evangelistic hermeneutic on the Bible. The Bible was written to bring people and all people groups to faith in Jesus Christ as his disciples. And so that's kind of a tool I use to interpret the 66 books of the Bible, put it in the context of God's goal to redeem unto himself billions of humans from all the people groups of the world. And therefore, that guides how I interpret the different creation texts. But it's not unique to me. It goes back all the way to the beginning of the church. Okay, I think this is the real issue, though. As I've debated young earth creationists, it's not the age of the earth, it's the issue of death. And what I hear from people like Ken Ham is that an all-powerful, all-good, all-loving God would not bring death upon his creatures unless it could be the result of the human sin. And therefore, the blame is on Adam's sin, saying it's because of Adam's sin we have death. Before Adam, we had no death. Now, right away, you got a theological problem because Adam is not the first sinner. Satan is the first sinner. And the Bible is silent on when Adam sinned against God, when he first sinned against God. But for sure, we know it happened before Adam sinned, because Satan, after all, was the one that tempted Eve. And the only text we got to go on for how long the angels have been around is what you see in Job 38:7, where it says they were witnesses to God laying down the foundations of the earth. But the Bible doesn't tell us whether Satan sinned before God created the earth or after God created the earth. But he certainly sinned before Adam did. So we need to put the blame on Satan. But even then, it's like, why would God's hands be tied by the behavior of his creatures? So in that sense, I don't think it's appropriate to blame animal and plant and bacterial death upon the actions of Adam. And I would argue that this is backed up by Scripture. The only two Bible passages that address the kind of death that Adam introduced when he sinned are Romans 12 and 1 Corinthians 15. They're the only two texts in the Bible. And again, when I debated young earth theologians, they totally agree with me that the Bible is silent on this issue, except for Romans 5:12 through to 19 and 1 Corinthians 15 to 20. But these texts attribute human death, not animal or plant death, to Adam's sin. There's no mention of plant and animal death, only human death. This is what you see in Romans 5:12. Sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin. And in this way, death came to all people because all sinned. The newer translations say people instead of men. So sin entered the world, and the only species of life on planet Earth that can experience sin are human beings. We're the only spirit species on the planet. And so animals don't sin. We are the ones that sin. And when it says death through sin, that identifies human beings. And notice the text says, death came to all people. It does not say death came to all life. And you get this repeated as well in 1 Corinthians 15, 20 to 22. Once again, it says that the sin of Adam brought death to all people, both physical death and spiritual death. But in the debates I've had with Ken Ham, he writes this, does an old earth view destroy the basis of the gospel message? And this is where I get accused of heresy, because young earth creationists tie the doctrine of the atonement to the age of the earth by claiming if there's blood being shed of animals before the fall of Adam, then that means that the doctrine of the atonement goes out the window. But I would disagree based on what I see in the book of Hebrews, where it says it's impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. The shed blood of bulls and goats was a symbol for the shed blood that would take away sin. And therefore, I'd argue the age of the universe has no bearing on any salvation doctrine. Notice the age of the universe is not present in any of the creeds of the church. The creeds focus on what is essential for all Christians to believe. Now, to be fair to Ken Ham, he does say that believing in an old earth doesn't mean that you're heretical, but it does mean that your beliefs imply heresy, which, from my perspective, is the same thing as saying that it's heretical. And he's not alone. It was the preacher, John MacArthur, who said in his sermons, if you believe in an old earth or an old universe, you're in sin. And again, he's trying to claim that the old earth perspective damages or destroys the gospel message. But I don't see that being sustained when I speak on seminary campuses. I've yet to find a doctoral level theologian who would agree with that perspective. And again, I would make the point, only if the Genesis creation days are long time periods can one hold that all 27 of the Bible's chapter length creation texts are literal and consistent. And again, check out this book, A Matter of Days, or look at the unedited debates. And again, many of them are online. And the longest debate I had lasted 3 days. That was between me and 3 young earth creationist theologians. Unfortunately, it didn't get recorded, but I did write about some of their arguments in the book Navigating Genesis, and I got their permission to print what I wrote. They said, yes, it was accurate. So I'll take questions.
That 3-day debate, was that 3 24-hour days?
3 24-hour days, although all of us were allowed to go to bed for 8 hours during those 3 24-hour days.
Oh, I'm sorry. I know it's late in or early in the morning for you, but I couldn't resist that.
No, that's a
Yes.
good one.
That
And
was
to be fair,
hilarious.
that debate was predominantly on Noah's flood. We spent about 1 day on the age of the earth and 2 days on Noah's flood.
Wow.
Just on that, Hugh, can you explain the Young Earth creation arc model as it pertains to the speciation and Philip Kitchener's observations? He's a philosopher of science at Columbia University.
Yeah, and Philip Kitchener is a philosopher of science. He's also an atheist. But what he wrote in that book, and I cited him in my book, A Matter of Days, he says the irony is that young earth creationists believe in naturalistic evolution at a rate that's more than 10,000 times greater than what any of us atheists would ever propose. And what he was citing was the fact that young earth creationists believe that the millions of species of animals, terrestrial animals on the face of the earth today, evolved from about 1,500 species that were on board the ark, which would have been the maximum carrying capacity of Noah's Ark. And to be fair, Young Earth Creationists never used the word evolution, which you see particularly in the writings from Answers in Genesis and the Institute of Creation Research. They use the word diversification. They say the 1,500 species on Noah's Ark within a couple of centuries rapidly evolved or rapidly diversified into the 4 million species we see of terrestrial animals today. But Kitcher is right. That's a rate of evolutionary change or diversification that's 10,000 times greater than even the most aggressive model that's being proposed by naturalistic atheists. Now, he only talked about Noah's Ark, but it actually shows up at a second place, and that's at the fall of Adam. Because Young Earth Creationists, as I just said, believe there was no death of plants and animals until Adam sinned. And there was no carnivorous activity. So they're basically saying animals were not killing one another until Adam fell into sin. But that means they have to hypothesize that these herbivores rapidly evolved into carnivores shortly after Noah fell into sin. And this becomes a challenge, say, for sharks, because 1/3 of the body weight of sharks is their liver. And that wouldn't be sustainable if they were simply eating vegetable matter. The shark is critically dependent on carnivorous activity. And so that huge liver would have to diversify in an extremely short period of time from a tiny liver. And likewise, the weaponry that these carnivores have has to rapidly evolve. But I've also pointed out in my book of Matter Days is that if you negate the death of plants and animals before Noah's fall, you've got a problem with Earth's biodeposits, because at a minimum, there's 76 quadrillion tons of dead living material in the crust of the Earth. And there's no way you're going to get that in 10,000 years of animals living and dying. It must be a much longer period of time. Now, Young Earth Creationists have tried to rebut that by saying that the energy from the sun was converting dead animal and plant tissue into biodeposits with 100% efficiency. But that would require a radical alteration of the thermodynamic laws, against something that the Bible explicitly rules out. The book of Ecclesiastes talks extensively about the thermodynamic laws and how they've always been here. So you really can't explain the biodeposits from a young Earth perspective. There's way too much of it.
Is there anyone else that would like to ask a question?
Well,
I've got a couple.
Yeah.
Well, the first one is, if God has been resting since creation, what was going on with all the miracles? What does that count as?
That's a great question. What you see during God's day of rest, he stops performing his creation miracles, but he's very active in performing his redemptive miracles. Look at the book of Acts. You'll see God miraculously intervening all throughout the book of Acts so that people can come to faith in Christ. And I actually wrote this book back here. Let me see if I can find it. Yeah, this book, Always Be Ready, where I document that the miracles you see in the book of Acts, they're happening right now. I've experienced them throughout the whole of my Christian life. When I share my faith, especially when I share my faith in parts of the world where there's supernatural suppression of the gospel, God performs miracles. to break through those supernatural barriers. I personally experienced it. Thousands of other Christians have personally experienced it. God is still performing miracles, just that they're in a different category.
I've got a question
Okay.
about the statement, Hugh, that you made about the early appearance of phyla and classes and orders and families being turned
Right.
on its head. From an evolutionary point of view, my understanding is that those higher orders would actually be formed earlier on. So the divergence of those major group, the more major the group is, the earlier that it has diverged, and that the process, that the fundamental
how-
structures are not
Uh,
created by lots of long periods of evolution, that the actual major patterns and more important differences actually have to be laid down first. So I'm not actually aware of any evolutionary biologists who would actually be saying that those groups would appear later. They would actually should appear earlier.
well,
Yeah, well, in my books,
there would be less differences between those groups earlier on.
yeah, well, what's interesting is when you read the literature of the paleontologists, they're the ones that are saying this is an enormous problem for a naturalistic model. People like James Valentine and Irwin and Sapolsky, they're the ones that are writing about the Avalon and Cambrian explosions. And they're particularly disturbed. None of them are theists, but they're particularly disturbed by the fact that the phyla show up at the very beginning of the Cambrian explosion. Their anticipation was, yes, we're going to get the invertebrate phyla first, then the vertebrate phyla, and last of all, we're going to get the chordate phyla. But that's not what you see. The chordates are there at the very beginning of the Cambrian explosion. The vertebrates along with the invertebrates. And what's particularly disturbing for the naturalists, they show up simultaneously. It's not like you get one phylum, then another phylum, then another phylum. They all show up simultaneously, and they show up immediately when the oxygen permits their existence. So for example, with the Avalon explosion, you have this great unconformity. It's a geological disturbance where you get these enormous landslides off the continents into the oceans. And what it does is it jumps the oxygen content in Earth's atmosphere from less than 1% up to 8%. And it happens suddenly. You get this jump from less than 1% to 8%, but explains why before the first Cambrian Avalon explosion, all you see are microbes and colonies of microbes, because you can't have large plants and animals with less than 1% oxygen. You need a minimum of 8%. But the moment it hits 8%, these phyla suddenly appear. There's no time delay. And that's what's disturbing people like Valentine and Sapolsky and Irwin, is the suddenness and the simultaneity which the phyla appear, and they appear before we see any diversification of the species and the genera. As they point out in their research papers, if it's naturalistic, we would expect that the diversification of species and genera would occur before the higher taxa. But it's the opposite. The higher taxa appear first.
No, we wouldn't. I don't believe we would expect that. I mean, there's certainly a lot of debate at the moment about the actual processes that produce this sort of really rapid development, if you want to use that word rather than evolution, development of all these, basically very different forms that appear very quickly altogether. But they're not saying that those big differences actually, took a long time to evolve. They're actually acknowledging that they appeared very quickly. It's just the mechanisms. They're saying natural selection by accumulation of the current process that we see in more recent times doesn't explain that. So there's this extended evolutionary system now being discussed, that there must be things we don't fully understand yet about the mechanism by which animals
you're
produce
exactly
change.
right. That's what Valentine, Sapolsky, and Irwin wrote in their papers. They said, if we're appealing to natural selection, mutations horizontal gene exchange, epigenetics. Those mechanisms cannot explain the simultaneity and the rapidity that we see many times in the fossil record. There must be some undiscovered hidden mechanism.
Mhm.
Now, if you read the scientific literature on what's being hypothesized for that hidden mechanism, all I've been able to find is people from the Santa Fe Institute saying there's a fourth law of thermodynamics. But the problem with appealing to a fourth law of thermodynamics is that it violates the anthropic principle. In order to have light anywhere, anytime in the universe must be homogeneous and uniform on large scales and over the whole period of the existence of the universe, which eliminates the possibility for a fourth law of thermodynamics. Yes, the people at the Santa Fe Institute, in fact, I heard them give a lecture at Caltech. And in their lecture, it was Stuart Kaufman that gave the lecture. In the first half of his lecture, he basically said, these naturalistic mechanisms to explain the history of light, they don't work. And here's why they don't work. It's got to be something else, but all he could come up with was a fourth law of thermodynamics. And basically said, if it's anything else, we would have discovered it. But he was thinking there is a way to hide the fourth law of thermodynamics, but he's not an astronomer. Astronomers have written, you can't hide the fourth law. If there is such a law, it will be obvious. As a matter of fact, we wouldn't even be here if there was a fourth law. So that's the conundrum that the naturalists are facing right now. And they frankly admit that it's a conundrum. They call this an intractable problem. And I quote them extensively in my book, Improbable Planet. I quoted from 7 different review papers on the Avalon and Cameron explosions. The one consistent factor is the more we learn about these explosive events in the fossil record, the more impossible it becomes to interpret the history of light from a naturalistic perspective. They don't speculate on what non-naturalistic perspectives, they just leave it at that. But again, from a Christian perspective, if it's not naturalistic, it's got to be some theistic intervention.
Yes, I guess my view is that we can't actually know whether it was naturalistic or not, because the way things worked right back in those early stages of life may have been quite different, particularly from the DNA and the genetics of it and how it worked. I mean, it's a whole different kind of system when you only had, relatively few organisms and it was an early stage. So I suspect we may never actually work out those mechanisms, but it doesn't mean to say that they couldn't be naturalistic. Anyway,
Well,
that's just where I'm at.
Yeah, we're on that. And you're right. I mean, we have found 2 new mechanisms, horizontal gene exchange and epigenetics.
Epigenetics, yeah.
Yeah, in the past 40 years. But notice those mechanisms deliver smaller results than natural selection mutations. We may find a 5th mechanism, but people like Sapolsky and James Valentine are saying we may find additional mechanisms, but they're not going to make much of a difference because we're getting diminishing returns. Darwin proposed natural selection, and then we got Mendel saying, well, there's mutations, and then they came up with horizontal gene exchange and then epigenetics. But the possibility you're going to get a 5th factor that's going to be much more predominant than those 4. James Valentine says that's wishful thinking. It's not going to happen. We will learn more, but it's not going to make a difference.
But there could be even a very different process happening with natural selection where you get really basic differences in animal structure and layout based on segmentation, where you basically sort of have a lot of replication of body parts and then you specialize them. And so, like you could have a situation where natural selection is working on the same sort of basic materials, but coming up with these very different designs. Because at that stage, a lot of that genetic control wasn't all locked down. So, like with crustaceans, where you have multiple multiple segments, each being specialized, and insects where you basically have 6 sort of main body segments, etc., and arachnids, etc., with the different numbers of parts. You could imagine natural selection working under a different scenario where the genetic material was very different. You could actually have that very radical evolution going on, and you didn't have the same levels of competition. You had a whole lot of new niches created, so life could actually operate and function.
Evolutionary biologists have made that appeal. They said, well, give us enough time, maybe we can make this all work. But I just cited a paper in one of my articles making the point, we now know that the time window for the beginning of the Cambrian explosion is briefer than 400,000 years. So the time constraints are no longer 50 million years wide. We're now down to just 400,000 years. And it may be even briefer than that. That's the best we've been able to come up with in terms of the error bars, which means if there is something very rapid going on that has escaped our attention, we should be able to see it in the natural world today, and we should be able to duplicate it in experiments. So for example, I'll give you one example. Michigan State University said, we can speed these things up enormously beyond what we see in the natural realm by doing lab experiments on bacteria. Bacteria are the fastest evolvers on the planet. And so they've been running an experiment that's now gone on for 35 years, basically trying to explore if we actually control the experiments and speed up the processes as fast as possible, what are the limits? And they've published 3 papers over the past 35 years. We cite them on our website, but basically they're saying there's severe limits on how rapidly we can make things happen, even at the bacterial level, let alone at the mammalian level.
But you're working with the products of millions of billions of years of evolution. And in all that time, there's been so much capacity for things to be locked down. So why would you expect to be able to produce those fundamental differences that needed to be produced early on in life's
Well, what
tree?
you'll see in the papers produced by Michigan State University is we know the Cambrian now is less than 400,000 years. And look at all that happened during those 400,000 years. It's the most radical pace of change in the forms of animals ever seen in the history of the earth. They basically said, we can compare and under lab conditions with bacteria as a proxy for what can happen for more advanced, because we can scale the evolutionary speeds. And therefore they're saying 35 years is a wide enough period of time to test what can happen over 10 million years.
I don't think time is the factor. I think it's about plasticity of the genome.
Well, there again, that can be tested at the bacterial level. Let's see what can be done. And let's see what can be done under laboratory conditions, not just lab, natural conditions. Obviously, in the lab, you can speed things up dramatically. That's basically why they did this long-term evolution experiment. If you search for that, you'll find it. Long-term evolution experiment, that'll pop up for you, all the papers.
May I speak very briefly?
Sure, go ahead.
Wouldn't viruses mutate and evolve faster than bacteria?
I didn't quite hear all that.
Wouldn't viruses mutate and evolve faster than bacteria?
Well, yeah, viruses do change faster than the bacteria, but that raises a debate. Most biologists do not think that viruses are living organisms. They can't survive independently, and they're basically gene products. So they depend on bacteria. And there's been a big debate, did God create the viruses, or did these viruses just happen as a result of the thermodynamic breakdown of bacteria? That's a debate that's still going on. However, we've written papers making the point that you must have the viruses together with the first bacteria, because if you didn't, Earth would quickly become a giant bacterial slime ball and would absorb all the resources that future life would need. The viruses play a crucial role in keeping the bacteria in check. They also play a crucial role in the water cycle. We didn't have this huge abundance of viruses. We wouldn't be getting the rain and snowfall that we need to sustain life on the continental land masses. And part of that is viruses breaking up the bacteria, and they also becoming seeds for rain and snow. But you are right, viruses can mutate very rapidly, and you can get
As we've
simultaneous
seen in recent months.
happening.
As we've seen in recent months.
Oh, yes.
Well, we know, of course, that viruses are based on RNA, not DNA. DNA has a very much greater self-correction code in it than RNA does. So it, yes, there's much greater proliferation of errors in the virus codes rather than bacteria, for instance, which are based on DNA.
Well, I mean, we were just talking about, could you get the Cambrian explosion happening more rapidly?
Yes.
And there are people that are claiming that the endogenous retroviruses you see in the genomes of all animals,
Yes.
that they're the result of viruses being incorporated into our genome. And my colleague Fazal Rana, our staff biochemist, is basically making the point that hypothesis is a mistake. Those endogenous retroviruses were put into the genome to prevent those animals from dying nearly instantly from viral attacks. They're defenses against the viruses. And they're not identical to the viruses that attack us. They're designed to defend the organism from viral attack. So of course they look a lot like the viruses. That's why they call them endogenous retroviruses. They have a lot of similarity. You need that similarity in order for the organism to be able to defend itself against viral attack. The other thing that Fazal Rana writes about is that you see in the genomes of animals that there are these genes that turn on and off with respect to the endogenous retroviruses, because the defense is far more important in the infancy of the animals than it is in their adulthood. And so what you'll see, so for newborn babies, is that these genes are turned on and a lot of energy of that infant is focused on dealing with the viral attacks. But as you go into adulthood, those genes are turned off because the energy can be more fruitfully engaged elsewhere. And the adults are not as susceptible to the viral attacks as a newborn infants are. And you see this across the animal kingdom.
Hugh, on that Cambrian explosion, didn't 100 out of the 182 mathematical possible skeletal designs conceivable for physical life, 146 showed up at the Cambrian explosion? So you're saying they all occurred within a 400,000 year time frame?
Well, there's still two phyla that they've not been able to push into the early Cambrian. I wrote an article a couple of months ago how the Bryozoa, because what you see in the textbooks, there are three phyla that exist today that were not present at the beginning of the Cambrian explosion. But these phyla produce fossils that are very difficult to detect if they're about 500 million years old. The Bryozoa fossils, for example, they're only a fraction of a millimeter across. And so what you see in the textbooks, we don't see any Bryozoa until 40 million years after the end of the Cambrian period. But not far from Adelaide, they found the fossils of Bryozoa that date to the very beginning of the Cambrian explosion. There's an island just south of Adelaide. I forget the name of the island.
Kangaroo Island?
Pardon me, which one?
Kangaroo Island?
Kangaroo Island.
That's right. It was in Kangaroo Island that they made this discovery. They got published just 2 months ago, but it was a breakthrough discovery, and that they found Bryozoa and the fossils and the rocks that date to the earliest time of the Cambrian explosion. So now there's only two phyla that are not present at the beginning of the Cambrian. And now there's speculation, if you look hard enough, they'll probably be there at the beginning of the Cambrian. We just haven't found them yet. But of the 35 that exist today, 28 are there at the beginning of the Cambrian explosion, and probably all 30.
So Peter, do you think that's been addressed well enough for you?
I'm still not really happy because Hugh, you keep on stressing the time factor, but clearly these radiations are special because they happen so rapidly, and that's the problem. And I'm really saying the time factor is irrelevant. It's more likely to be about the plasticity of the genome. And it doesn't matter how much time you spend. I'm familiar with those experiments with bacteria and the number of generations you can get, but it doesn't matter how much time you spend. If you basically got a rigid genome, that then you're not going to get that kind of diversification. But if you had a much more plastic genome, then the time becomes irrelevant.
Yeah, but don't you appreciate that before that Cambrian explosion, we don't see any of this happening? After the Cambrian explosion, we don't see any of it happening. It seems to be all focused within that 400,000 year period. If there is that kind of plasticity, why don't we see it before? Why don't we see it after? I mean, we're looking at 3.8 billion years of life history on planet Earth. And again, look at the papers by James Valentine, Irwin, and Sapolsky. They're very clear that this is a major issue. And in fact, you can read all the reviews on the Cambrian explosion. I've read them all, and they're all realizing that this is an enormous intractable problem for every naturalistic model.
So I guess, yeah.
Yeah, and they're claiming maybe we'll find something, but I like what James Valentine says, hey, maybe we'll find another mechanism, but it's not going to make any difference.
So even if we have only a small window in the fossil record in that period, you'd still expect to see a lot more diversity within the basic structures and the variation sort of between them, or within the basic forms than what exists. Is that what you're saying? You don't actually see in that period enough diversity?
Well, you're seeing the higher taxa showing up first. And so it's the opposite of what you expect.
It's not.
That
It's the
the
opposite of what I
phyla show up
expect.
first, then the classes, then the orders, then the families, and last of all, you get the genera and the species.
No, you
And
can't
so-
evolve things the other way around. It's not. No evolutionists would actually claim that you evolve things the other way around.
Well, I'm citing what they've written in the scientific literature. And they're saying, trying to get, that's what James Valentine says we're really stuck because we're getting the phyla first. They show up simultaneously. They show up suddenly. This is something no naturalistic model would ever predict, but it's exactly what we see at the beginning of the Cambrian explosion. Now, he doesn't speculate philosophically. He just says, this is an enormous problem that can't be ignored. Says my peers are ignoring it, and I'm saying this is the data. He also cites the fact that when you try to do this genetically, and I hear that's what you're trying to do, saying maybe there's something going on at the genetic level, but he and others have pointed out, you do not get a concurrence between the fossil record and the molecular clocks. Particularly with the Cambrian explosion, the molecular clock dates differ from the fossil record by as much as a 250 million years, 250 million year diversity between what you'd expect from doing it genetically from what you see in the fossil record.
Okay.
If it's naturalistic, the molecular clocks should give you the same dates as the fossil evidence, and they're discordant. There are places where they are concordant. And I want to make that clear. As a Christian, I believe it's not 100% miraculous intervention. It's a combination of naturalistic process and divine intervention. And so I'd anticipate there'd be multiple places where the molecular clocks will be in concordance with a fossil record. But as Valentine and others people have pointed out, especially with the Avalon and Cambrian explosion, there's a huge discontinuity between the genetics and the fossil record. That's explainable from a creation perspective, but it's not explainable from a naturalistic perspective. And I'm not the one saying this. It's the people who take a non-theistic perspective that are making these statements.
Okay. Trevor, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but I'm bringing this up. Trevor pointed out to me a couple of weeks ago after a talk with Fuzz that he thought that Neanderthals were an early human species, or one of the first humans. Can you, Hugh, discuss why that isn't, why you would see that not being the case?
Yeah, and this debate has come up because there is some genetic evidence that early humans may have mated with later Neanderthals. It's not compelling, but the evidence is there and it can't be denied. It is at such a low level, though, that the idea that the image of God has been distorted is not the case. The genetic evidence, if it is real, is way below the level of bestiality we see between 21st century humans and the great apes. So we're talking something that's incredibly minor, if indeed it is real. But when you compare the genome of the Neanderthals with the genome of humans, we now have a complete human genome. That got published about a month ago. We don't yet have a complete genome for Neanderthals. It's about 2/3 complete. But where we can overlap them, we only see a 1% difference between the human genome and the Neanderthal genome. But a 1% difference is considered to be so great that there's no doubt in the scientific literature we're looking at a distinct species. It's genetically distinct, and it's certainly morphologically distinct. When you look at Neanderthals, they have, very strong, facial muscles that control the jaw, much stronger than we humans. Their brain structure is radically different. They have a long, oblong skull, whereas humans have a globular skull. They have a tiny parietal lobe. We have a huge parietal lobe. So our brains are able to do things their brains can't do. Their eye structure is different. Their spinal cord is different. They have short arms and short legs. Morphologically, they're very well designed to survive in a cold climate without clothing. We humans are the opposite. We're poorly designed for a cold climate, but we're optimally designed for a warm climate. We got a great perspiration system. We're tall and thin. We don't have a lot of body hair. And so we do way better than the Neanderthals in a warm climate. But in terms of the difference in the brain structure, what's interesting is how quickly humans replaced Neanderthals and quickly moved into climate zones far colder than Neanderthals. The reason being, humans quickly developed clothing technology. The best we can come up with the Neanderthals, they might have used the skins of animals that they hunted as unmanufactured capes, which would have made good bedding material, but wouldn't have helped them much to survive in a cold climate. And where we do see them in Siberia, it's exclusively in caves. So caves would provide them some protection against the cold elements. But humans were living in climate zones 15 degrees centigrade colder than what Neanderthals could live in spite of the fact that our anatomy was against us. They have a great anatomy for a cold climate. We got a very poor anatomy for a cold climate, but humans immediately launched clothing technology. When you look at the Neanderthals, we see no evidence for sewing implements. With humans, you see them right away. And with Neanderthals, their tool use is always a single implement, a stick or a rock. With humans, you very quickly get axes with wood and sinews and an axe head. You get bows and arrows. but you don't see that for the Neanderthals. And we're arguing in our books, and I just finished a book where I compare Neanderthals and Homo erectus with humans, and basically bring up a new piece of evidence. The populations of the bipedal primates that preceded humans, the latest literature is saying the population numbers probably never got past 10,000. And with Neanderthals likely never got past 8,000. The highest I've seen in the scientific literature is 15,000, but given their geographical range, the population density is about 0.001 per square kilometer. So way below the population density of Australia for humans, and basically making a point with them being that dispersed and being a population level that low and a body size that great, they couldn't have evolved. And it's evidenced by the fact that the latest Neanderthals really can't be distinguished from the earliest Neanderthals. We don't see any evolution in their morphology or in their tool use. In fact, the latest genetic evidence is showing that the most recent Neanderthals were highly inbred, which is support for the idea that the population had to be very low. And the lower the population, the higher the probability for extinction. And there's studies that show if you've got an adult body size of more than 3 kilograms and a population that is below 100,000 individuals, that's a species that will go extinct before it undergoes any significant evolution.
Am I right in saying that Australia never had any Neanderthals on the continent, and we have the highest extinction rate of mammals?
That's correct. Yeah. Not only have no Neanderthals.
I thought Neanderthals were pretty much exclusively European.
Yeah, it's Europe and Siberia, but Australia hasn't had any bipedal primates previous to humans, at least none that have been discovered. I mean, the closest one you see is Homo forensis in Indonesia, but Homo forensis is yet to be found in Australia. And by the way, those dates are recent, 18 to 30,000 years ago. So, but yes, if you compare the extinction rate of large bodied birds and mammals in sub-Saharan Africa, it's 4%. In Australia, it's above 94%. And what was interesting, we attended a conference on anthropology, and it was Ian Tattersall. We had a lot of conversations with him. He's an atheist, but he says, what bothers me about theistic evolutionists in the Christian camp, they think that we humans are not exceptional. It says, where I agree with you folks with reasons to believe, I think humans are exceptional. And he was the one that pointed out to us, notice what happened in Australia and what didn't happen in Africa. Africa had at least 10 different species of bipedal primates over a 6 million year period. Australia, we have no evidence, but when humans invaded Africa, the extinction rate was only 4%. When they invaded Australia, the extinction rate was 94%. And he says, notice in Africa, Asia, and Europe, humans developed civilization, whereas all you saw in Australia before the arrival of the Europeans was Stone Age technology and a low human population. They wiped out the animals they needed to watch. And so Ian Tattersall's point was that this sequence over 6 million years basically trained these animals. When you see tall bipedals with weapons in their hands, run away. But what happened in Australia, the animals didn't run away. They got wiped out.
Okay. Trevor, did you have any other questions or any to make?
Yeah, you're muted.
You're muted. Unmute yourself, Trev.
I've got a
Plenty of questions, but in view of the time frame, I don't think I should bring up another topic. But I was interested in your comments on the Neanderthals and the debate on that. Could you say categorically, though, that they're saying there was sex between Neanderthals and our humans? So there's not a problem genetically for a marriage of a Neanderthal with what you're talking about?
Well, again, the evidence is there. I would argue that the evidence is not something you can simply brush aside, but it's not compelling. It's not at the level of proof. And so it's still being debated whether this really happened. And if it did happen, a major part of the debate is, would the offspring be fertile? So there are papers being published where they said, well, the fact that we see so little evidence genetically for this inbreeding indicates that likely the offspring were not fertile. So it'd be similar to what you see with the breeding of donkeys and horses. You get mules, but the mules cannot reproduce after their own kind. So, but again, this is hotly disputed in the scientific literature. So nothing definitive can be said on this. But we do stand by our model that Neanderthals are distinct from modern humans. And that's a debate that's still raging between young Earth creationists and old Earth creationists. Young Earth creationists hold that Neanderthals and Homo erectus are fully human, whereas we had reasons to believe, say, no, we see them as distinct species.
Jeff, have you got anything to say? Jeff, are you there? No? Beth to Jeff?
There he is.
Yeah, but I've had my video off and my mute off. Look, no, I don't really. I'm going to have to do a lot more research on this before I could make comments and ask appropriate questions. Thanks anyway. Thanks for the presentation.
Yeah, and where all of you can go, I mean, I don't know whether you're aware of a site called PubMed. They archive all the life science literature, and all the abstracts are free to read, and many of the full papers you can also read for free. So PubMed, that's all you got to put into a search engine. It'll pop it up for you. And if any of you are interested in the physical sciences, NASA maintains an archive of physical science research papers. And you can get that at adswww.harvard.edu.
Thank you.
Just got one more quick question about the Cambrian explosion. From a theological point of view, Hugh, how do you understand, or how would you understand the extinction of a lot of sort of basic life patterns that never appear again? So if we're saying that, well, these must have been made through an act of miraculous special creation, why would God create a whole lot of things that would suddenly disappear? I mean, yeah.
That's a great question. I've addressed it in a couple of my books, basically saying the faint sun paradox gives you the insight, and it's verified in Psalm 104. And I've been trying to engage my evolutionary biologist friends on this, saying, don't just look at the genetics and the paleontology, you also need to look at solar astrophysics. Because what we see with the sun is that it's fusing hydrogen into helium. But as it fuses hydrogen to helium, it increases the efficiency of the nuclear furnace. So the sun gets brighter and brighter as it gets older and older. And today it's about 23% brighter than when the first bacteria showed up on the Earth. Well, life on Earth can only tolerate about a 1% change in the energy that's received at the surface of the Earth from the sun. And here we're talking 23%. And what you see in Psalm 104, verses 29 and 30, it's a property of all life to die off, but God recreates and renews the face of the earth. And in order to compensate for the brightening of the sun, it's crucial that you have these mass extinction events where millions of species are removed from planet Earth and quickly replaced, relatively quickly, by millions of new species, where the new species are more efficient at pulling greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere than the older species. And what I argue in support of our model is only a mind that knows the future physics of the sun would know which light to remove from planet Earth and which new light to replace that with, and how frequently that needs to be done. To compensate for the brightening of the sun, these mass extinction events, followed by mass speciation events, need to happen about once every 30 to 35 million years. But we now have a detailed enough fossil record that at least for the past 500 million years verifies that that indeed is a frequency of mass extinction and mass speciation events, and that it indeed is animals and plants being introduced to draw just the right amount of greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere to keep the temperature at the surface of the Earth optimal for life. That's also something you see in Psalm 104. God packs our planet with as much life as possible, as diverse as possible, for as long as possible. But because of what's happening to the sun, that requires periodic mass extinction events followed by mass speciation events. And the fossil record verifies that.
But this was long before humans were around to appreciate it. So God created this just for his own delight, presumably.
Well, not just for his own delight, but also to ensure we have the resources we need to launch and sustain global civilization. It's that 3.8 billion years of previous history of life that gives us the resources that we need. You know, I've written articles making the point that you need 3 billion years of bacterial and microbial activity to chemically transform the planet from a planet dominated by insoluble or soluble metals, where it's transformed into a planet dominated by insoluble metals. The bacteria can handle soluble metals. Big plants and animals cannot. And it explains why you don't see any big stuff on planet Earth until the plant has been chemically transformed by the microbes. And then the plants and the animals that have existed for the past 500 million years, that explains our limestone deposits, our deposits of marble, coal, oil, natural gas, gypsum. And without that, we couldn't have launched and sustained global human civilization or come up with a population where there's billions of us here at one time. We need those biodeposits.
I sort of think it's interesting that where, for example, we see an issue of life responding to the increase in the temperature of the sun, for example, that we invoke God miraculously intervening in life, but the RTB view seems to never invoke God miraculously intervening to adjust the astronomical physical universe. And I just wonder if that's a sort of a bias in the approach.
Well, I think it's explained by the fact we're looking at the physical universe. We're looking at something orders of magnitude simpler. So we would expect those kinds of interventions to be less frequent, but they're there nonetheless. I mean, the space-time theorems prove that space and time were created entities along with matter and energy. I mean, that's the biggest miracle you could ever hope to scientifically prove. And that's in astrophysics, not in biology. But I think it's crucial that we balance the God of the gaps with the no God of the gaps. And so it's pursuing the gaps where we get progress. If we pursue the gaps that we see in competing scientific models and see how does advancing research make the gaps smaller or make the gaps bigger.
Yeah.
If the gaps are getting bigger and bigger, more and more numerous, and more problematic, we know we got the wrong scientific model. But if the gaps are getting smaller, less numerous, and less problematic, we know we're on the pathway to the correct model. But we're never going to get a perfect model. We're never going to know everything. But gaps and anomalies, I think, are a very powerful tool to determine which models are right and which models are wrong. And I'm actually writing an article now in a peer-reviewed journal saying to make this scientific enterprise work, we need not ignore the theistic models. Make them compete with the non-theistic models, and make them compete through doing research on gaps and anomalies. And let's see if we can make science progress at a more rapid rate. And I'm firmly convinced that we can make science advance at a more rapid rate if we use a conservative theistic model. Now, I do agree that there are Christians who are arguing for a far more aggressive, but there again, the gaps and the anomalies will show which Christian is right and which Christian is wrong.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that, Hugh.
You're welcome.
Yeah, Peter, I'd encourage you to read Improbable Planet, where Hugh goes into this one in depth. And when you're talking about the astrophysical evidence, I thought it was interesting how meteorites and seem to hit the Earth at appropriate times and cause good things to happen on the Earth eventually. A simple way of putting it. Yeah, look, thank you very much, Hugh. I think we'll finish the recording now. Thanks, Techno Man. He's been very quiet.
The Techno Man's about to get onto it.